Clearly, the opening part of 2023 is going to be dominated by rebellions against the Conservative government, all of the strikes, the very fierce exchanges now with the Labour Party. That's what, as it were, we're watching Sunak watch. But I think there is another big story which is bubbling, which is the revolt to Sunak's right. And it runs from the Liz Truss, quotes, pro-growth Tories, who haven't gone away and are still organising inside the House of Commons, right the way through to parties beyond the right of the Conservative Party. But it's going to be focused, I think, very much on, inevitably, Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson is not only receiving the freedom of Kyiv and writing his memoirs, or rather signing a deal to write his memoirs, because we know with Boris Johnson, signing the contract and actually writing the book can be two different things. But we're going to be focused very much, I think, on the Priveleges Committee hearings into those notorious Downing Street parties. I think the entire media world is going to be absolutely focused on the Boris Johnson threat. It's one of those vivid, highly coloured, kind of irresistible media stories, and it's going to be focused in these very theatrical scenes in the Priveleges Committee, which is going to be televised. So we're going to see Boris Johnson and his lawyer, Lord Panic, versus Harriet Harman, the steely, fact-driven Labour chair of that committee. And they're going to be going over, I think, in a lot of cringe-making detail, evidence from civil servants and others inside Downing Street about what actually happened in those parties. And everyone's going to be thinking, will Boris Johnson survive this? Will he mount some kind of challenge to Rishi Sunak, particularly if we see very bad election results in the local elections in May for the Conservatives, which we expect? And Boris Johnson and his supporters are clearly organised in some way. However, I think in the end it won't happen. And for the following reasons, I think Boris Johnson is likely to be very badly damaged by the Priveleges Committee report into those parties, less because they will find him guilty, though they might, of misleading the House, in which case he might have to leave politics temporarily, but more likely because it just reminds the entire country of that awful, shameful episode in our history, and it won't burnish Boris Johnson's reputation very much. If you're Rishi Sunak, there's two things you need to do with Boris Johnson and the revolt on the right inside the Conservative Party. One, you need to appease. So you need to talk an awful lot about growth. You need to talk a lot about levelling up. You need to have a very hard-line policy on the small boats and all of that. And there's already a disconnect between the way that Rishi Sunak presents himself as the kind of affable, centrist, family man, the kind of smiley, likes everybody kind of politician, and the politics he has to adopt in order to appease his right. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, I think he can start to ask some very hard questions of his critics on the right. What would they actually do about the economy? Are they seriously considering tax cuts at this moment when public finances are in such jeopardy? Do they want to be irresponsible about the public finances? What do they really want to do about the Ukraine war? Rather than sending 12 tanks, would they send 112 tanks? In practical terms, what is the right-wing agenda? And given the parlous state of the economy, that is quite a hard question to answer at the moment. The bigger right-wing threat to Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party isn't inside the Conservative Party. It isn't Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg or anyone like that. It is actually the Reform UK party. Reform UK originated in Nigel Farage's Brexit party. And of course, once Brexit was done, the point of the Brexit party seemed to recede, and Nigel Farage moved away from politics. He's now a television presenter. But the party that's picked up that mantle is called Reform UK, and it's led by a property developer, a very successful businessman called Richard Tice, who is kind of a crisper, slightly more affable version. He's not Nigel Farage. He doesn't seem to have that darkness in his soul quite so much. And he's putting together what I think is quite a potent populist right-wing agenda of a kind we haven't seen in Britain for a while.
Look, the reality is that this is a government that after 12 years have led to the country being literally broken. Wherever you look, nothing's working.
And I can give you some examples of that. For instance, on NHS and the NHS crisis, his policy is that all patient-facing staff in the NHS, doctors, nurses, ambulance staff and the rest of it should have 3 years of zero income tax. And that would be paid for by tightening up the conditionality and the rules on welfare and getting more people back into work. These are the kind of policies which I can see the Conservative Party flinching about. Now, what I know is that Conservative Central Office is really worried about Reform UK. Not because they think Reform UK, which most people probably haven't even heard of, are going to take lots of seats. They're plainly not. They may take no seats at all. But if they reach around 10 points in the polls during an election campaign, that effect would be devastating for the Conservative Party. It would probably turn a defeat into an utter rout, and it might eventually lead to the split in the Conservative Party. Now, Reform UK, without much publicity, are now running at between 8 and 9 points in the polls, not so far behind that. Every time there's been a shift towards the centre inside the Conservative Party, Reform UK gets lots of applications for members, presumably ex-Conservatives. So when Liz Truss appointed Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reform UK got about another 800 recruits in 24 hours. Since Liz Truss actually went and imploded and blew up, Reform UK have had about another 9,000 members. And they now have 700 people who have applied to be parliamentary candidates at the next general election, of whom about 500 have been vetted. So there is a kind of quite serious operation going on here. And if Reform UK gets enough publicity, gets enough support at the next election, then their effect on the Tory fortunes then will be devastating. And I think this is a much bigger story, perhaps, than what's going on with Boris Johnson or anybody else inside Parliament at the moment.